Imagine being so blind you can't tell your own sons apart. Today, we're diving into one of the most fascinating stories of deception in the Bible, Genesis 27. We'll explore how physical blindness reveals spiritual truth, why a mother and son conspired to deceive, and what this means for understanding divine grace. And with me is our biblical expert. Take it away.
You know, this story is absolutely wild when you really dig into it. We've got Isaac, who's elderly and blind, trying to give his blessing to Esau, his favorite son. But there's so much more happening beneath the surface.
Wait, so why was this blessing such a big deal?
Well, this wasn't just any blessing, this was the continuation of God's covenant with Abraham. We're talking about the future of Israel itself hanging in the balance.
And Isaac wanted to give this to Esau, even though there was a prophecy about Jacob?
Exactly. Before the twins were even born, God told Rebekah that the older would serve the younger. But Isaac had a blind spot, both literally and figuratively.
Tell me more about that blind spot.
See, Isaac's physical blindness actually mirrors something deeper. He was blind to Esau's character, a man who had already sold his birthright for a bowl of stew and married pagan wives that brought grief to the family.
That's fascinating. So his physical condition was kind of symbolic?
Absolutely. And you know what's really interesting? Scripture often links physical eyes with spiritual perception. It's a theme that runs throughout the Bible.
So what drove Isaac's blindness to Esau's true nature?
The text gives us a fascinating clue. It says Isaac had a taste for wild game. He was literally led by his sensual desires rather than spiritual discernment.
That's kind of like us today, isn't it? Getting distracted by physical pleasures instead of spiritual truth?
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting. Enter Rebekah.
Ah, yes, the mastermind behind the deception.
Well, it's more complex than that. Rebekah remembered God's prophecy about Jacob. She was actually acting on divine revelation, even though her methods were questionable.
But wasn't it still wrong to deceive Isaac?
That's the fascinating tension in this story. The Bible doesn't excuse the deception, but it shows how God worked through it to fulfill his purposes.
So what exactly did Rebekah and Jacob do?
They created this elaborate scheme, dressed Jacob in Esau's clothes, covered his hands and neck with goat skin to make him feel hairy like Esau, and prepared a meal that would taste like Esau's cooking.
And Isaac fell for it?
Well, he was suspicious. He said the voice was Jacob's, but the hands felt like Esau's. It's actually quite poignant, this elderly blind man trying to use his remaining senses to identify his son.
That's heartbreaking, really.
It is. But here's what's remarkable. Isaac's physical blindness actually became the mechanism that ensured God's prophecy would be fulfilled.
Wait, what do you mean?
If Isaac could have seen clearly, he would have recognized Jacob and the deception would have failed. His blindness was actually providential.
So God used even Isaac's disability as part of his plan?
Exactly. As Proverbs says, many are the plans in a person's heart, but the Lord's purpose will prevail.
But what about the consequences of the deception?
Oh, they were severe. Esau was furious and planned to kill Jacob. The family was fractured. Jacob had to flee his home.
So even when God's purposes are fulfilled, sin still has consequences?
Absolutely. The Bible never sugarcoats the effects of deception. This story actually becomes a pattern in Jacob's life. He deceives and is later deceived by others.
It's like a cycle of deception.
Right. And it's not just about Jacob. This story reveals something profound about how God works in human history.
How so?
Well, God doesn't need perfect people or perfect circumstances to accomplish his purposes. He works through flawed humans and messy situations.
That's actually really encouraging.
Isn't it? And you know what's fascinating? This whole episode becomes a pivotal moment in redemptive history.
How does it connect to the bigger picture?
The blessing Jacob received that day preserved the messianic line. The genealogy that eventually leads to Jesus runs right through this moment of deception.
So God's grace works even through human failure?
Exactly. And that's really the heart of this story. It's not just about blindness or deception, it's about grace.
Tell me more about that grace aspect.
Well, think about it. Everyone in this story fails in some way. Isaac ignores God's prophecy, Rebekah and Jacob deceive, Esau seeks to kill his brother. Yet God's purposes still prevail.
That's pretty amazing when you think about it.
And you know what's really interesting? Later in Genesis, we see Jacob himself wrestling with God, and he has to state his true name, the opposite of what he did here.
So there's a redemptive arc to his story?
Yes. God doesn't just use Jacob despite his flaws, he transforms him through them.
This story has so many layers.
And each layer reveals something new about how God works in human lives.
So what can we learn from all this?
I think one big lesson is about recognizing our own spiritual blindness. Just like Isaac, we can be blind to what's really important while focusing on the wrong things.
And maybe also about trusting God's purposes even when circumstances seem messy?
Absolutely. This story shows that God's purposes prevail even through our mistakes and failures.
It's kind of liberating, isn't it?
Yes, but it's also challenging. It calls us to examine our own lives. Where are we being spiritually blind? Where are we trusting in deception rather than God?
Those are some deep questions to wrestle with.
And that's exactly what this story invites us to do. Wrestle with these complex spiritual realities.
Just like Jacob literally wrestled with God later in his life.
Exactly. The physical and spiritual are always intertwined in these biblical narratives.
Well, as we wrap up, what's your final thought on this story?
I think it's a powerful reminder that God's grace is bigger than our failures. Even when we're blind, physically or spiritually, God's purposes prevail.
And sometimes, like with Isaac's blindness, what we see as a limitation might actually be part of God's plan.
That's profound. Our weaknesses can become the very means through which God's strength is displayed.
What a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on Copilot Podcasts, where sometimes it takes a little blindness to see the truth more clearly.